The night my father summoned me to his study, I knew he meant to decide my life. He sat there in his stiff back chair, uniform jacket still buttoned, though the day's heat had settled heavy on the house. Lamps threw shadows across his metals, as if honor itself were judging me. My belly had begun to swell with Samuel Reed's broken promise, and the disgrace of it hung like a noose around my throat. I half hoped he might forgive me, call it youthful foolishness. My father was not a man of forgiveness. He was a colonel, and I was his daughter. A piece of his legacy he refused to let shame. He said, "Ivy, you will marry Buck." The words clapped down harder than a rifle butt. Buck, the Apache man who worked the stockyards in town. The same man whose quiet nods I'd never thought twice about. I opened my mouth to protest, but my father's gaze cut the breath from me. He spoke of debts, how Buck owed him for sparing his life years ago, how the man would do as commanded, how this marriage would seal my disgrace in silence and restore the family name. I wanted to scream that I was not a ledger to be balanced, not some pawn to be pushed across his battlefield. But shame burned hotter than anger. What defense had I? Samuel had ridden off weeks ago without so much as a backward glance. The man who'd whispered forever into my ear had left me with nothing but a swelling belly and the taste of dust. My father pressed harder. "You'll be his wife by Sunday. Better a quiet union than a public scandal. Buck will keep the child as his own." He swore it. That startled me. I looked at Buck, standing silent near the door. His broad shoulders caught the lamplight, his dark eyes steady, unreadable. I expected reluctance, maybe bitterness at being ordered into such a bond. But instead he spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of something unshakable. "You will love the child as mine." No hesitation, no condition, just a vow laid bare. Tears pricked my eyes, though not from comfort. That a man I hardly knew could speak such words, while Samuel, the child's true father, had turned coward. It broke something in me. I felt crushed between shame, loss, and the heavy hand of duty. I wanted to run, to vanish into the night, to wake in a world where I had choices left. But as my father's jaw tightened and Buck's vow settled in the air, I understood the cage around me. Love had betrayed me, pride had abandoned me, and now only survival remained. So I bowed my head, sealing my fate with silence. My father called it honor. I called it surrender. The wedding came quick, too quick for me to catch my breath. Father wasted no time. The following Sunday, he hauled me to the little clapboard church on the edge of town. The place smelled of dust and wood rot. Pews empty save for the preacher's weary wife and father himself. No lace, no flowers, no music drifting from the organ loft. Just the echo of our boots against the floorboards and the murmur of vows I could barely force across my lips. Buck stood beside me, shoulders squared as though bracing against a storm. He looked out of place in the stiff collar father had insisted upon, yet he bore it with quiet patience.
When the preacher asked if he would take me, he answered without pause, "I will." His voice carried the weight of a man who kept his word, but there was no joy in it, no triumph, only a sober resolve. When it came to me, my own voice trembled. The words felt foreign in my mouth, dry as dust. I wasn't saying "I do" to a man. I was saying it to silence, to duty, to the death of whatever girl I'd been before Samuel Reed rode off. My father nodded in grim approval, as though this were a campaign won rather than a marriage forged. The preacher's wife dabbed her eyes with a kerchief, though I think it was pity more than celebration. I felt Samuel's ghost in that church, mocking me, whispering all the promises he'd left behind. My hands ached to throw off the ring, but I kept them still. Pride wouldn't allow me to shatter completely, not in front of Father, not in front of Buck. And then it was done. Husband and wife, bound by words spoken over an empty room. Father offered no blessing, no embrace. He merely shook Buck's hand, the gesture stiff, transactional, as though sealing a business deal. Then he turned and walked out, leaving me with the man he'd chosen in my stead. Outside, the wagon waited, wheels sunk slightly in the spring mud. Buck lifted our modest bags into the back and offered his hand to help me up. I hesitated, my pride railing against the touch, but in the end I let him steady me. His palm was warm, rough from work, and for one fleeting instant I felt something unexpected. Not ownership, not command, but steadiness. We sat side by side as the wagon lurched forward, the church shrinking behind us. No bells rang, no townsfolk waved, no rice showered down. Only the creak of the wheels and the lonely rhythm of hooves on the road. I stared straight ahead, bitterness weighing heavy in my chest. Samuel's memory gnawing like a wolf at the door of my heart. Yet when I glanced sideways, Buck was watching the road with quiet resolve, as if carrying both me and the future I hadn't chosen. I folded my hands over my belly, feeling the faint stir of the child within. Somewhere between us, in that silence, the truth pressed down. This was no love story, not yet. It was a hollow beginning, an arrangement carried out under the watchful eye of duty. And yet, as the wagon rolled toward the mountains, part of me wondered if silence could grow into something else.
The road wound higher with every turn, leaving the town behind and pulling us into the folds of the mountains where Buck made his home. The spring air carried the scent of pine, sharp and clean, a smell I was unaccustomed to after years spent in Father's well-oiled halls. I sat stiff in the wagon, my hand resting against my belly, trying not to imagine Samuel smirk if he could see me now, a colonel's daughter jolting toward a stranger's cabin, wearing the ring of a marriage she hadn't chosen. By the time the wagon creaked to a halt, dusk had painted the peaks in violet. Buck stepped down and offered me his hand again. I refused this time, though my knees shook as I climbed out. Before us stood his cabin, a squat structure of logs, smoke trailing from the chimney. No polished brass, no sweeping verandas, just rough-hewn walls and a roof patched with care. It was smaller than Father's stables, yet it pulsed with something Father's estate never had: humility. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of burning wood. Buck lit a lamp, and the glow revealed the modest space, a table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with chipped crockery, a bearskin draped by the hearth. To the right, a narrow room with a bed. To the left, another room, larger but plain. "You take the big room," Buck said, setting my bag inside. His voice was simple, matter of fact, as though it required no explanation. The words struck me harder than I expected. Samuel had never yielded anything for me. He only ever took what I gave him. Yet here was Buck, a man pressed into marriage, offering me comfort first. I wanted to scoff, to call it nothing more than pity, but the truth slipped under my defenses, leaving me unsettled. When we sat to supper, I expected awkward silence, but Buck moved with quiet assurance. He set a bowl of beans before me, bread beside it, and poured water into a tin cup. I had never eaten such a humble meal in my life, but the way he bowed his head and muttered words in his mother's tongue before lifting a spoon gave it a reverence I couldn't mock. I tasted the beans, plain but hearty, and he noticed my hesitation. He said, "I'll show you if you want to learn." A small thing, but it landed heavy. Samuel had promised me fine gowns, distant cities, music halls, things meant to dazzle. Buck offered me something smaller, but perhaps steadier, a place beside him in the daily work of survival. That night, alone in the larger room he'd surrendered, I sat on the bed and pressed my face into my hands. The ache of memory still clawed at me. Samuel's touch still burned in my skin. But for the first time since Father's decree, I felt the faintest shift. Not hope, not yet, but a crack in the wall of bitterness. The cabin was humble, the man beside me even humbler, yet some part of me wondered, against my will, if respect could grow in such soil. The days that followed tested me in ways I hadn't imagined. I had grown up in a house where servants carried trays and laundresses scrubbed linens. Now every task was mine, and I quickly learned how clumsy I was in the work that kept a cabin alive. The first time I tried to cook cornmeal, I scorched the bottom of the pan black. When I fetched water, I stumbled on the trail and spilled half of it before reaching the door. I pricked my fingers raw trying to mend a shirt of Buck's, the needle slipping as if mocking me. Each failure knotted my pride tighter. I could feel Father's scorn in the back of my mind, Samuel's laughter in the other. Buck said little, but his silence only magnified my humiliation. One afternoon, after a particularly miserable attempt at baking bread that turned out harder than stone, I collapsed on the floor by the stove and wept. Buck came in quietly, the door shutting behind him with a soft thud. I expected him to mock me, or worse, to show irritation. Instead, he crossed the room, squatted down, and placed a square cloth in my hands. It was soft from wear, edges embroidered with a faded pattern. "He's my mother's," he said gently, "for tears." I pressed it to my face, ashamed of my own weakness, yet struck by the tenderness of his gesture. I looked at him through blurred eyes, and for the first time, I saw not just a man bound to me by Father's command, but someone carrying his own quiet strength. "I don't belong here," I choked out. "I can't do any of this." "You'll learn," he said, no judgment in his voice. "We learn together." Something in me broke open at those words. Samuel had once told me I was perfect as I was, but that would have been a lie meant to seduce. Buck spoke to me as though imperfection was no sin, as though failure could be mended. That evening, I watched him carve wood by the fire. His hands were steady, his knife sure, each stroke peeling away what was unnecessary. When I asked what he was making,
He simply said, cradleboard. For the child. For the life I carried that was not his by blood, yet already his by vow. He smoothed the edges with such care, his face lit by firelight, and my chest ached with something unfamiliar. Gratitude, perhaps, or the first glimmer of trust. When I lay down that night, I realized my view of him had shifted. He was no longer just the man forced upon me. He was a shelter I didn't know I needed. My shame still lingered, but it no longer smothered me. Buck's patience had given me air. And as I closed my eyes, I thought, maybe in this place, with this man, I might find a way to live, not just endure.
The first snows came early that year, and by the time my pains began, the mountains were sealed in white. Wind rattled the shutters like a hungry beast, and the fire had to be fed constantly to keep the cabin from freezing. I had dreaded this day for months, knowing I'd have no mother, no midwife, no kindly neighbor women to guide me through. Only Buck. The labor struck hard and fast, searing through me like knives. I clutched the edge of the bed until my knuckles turned white, gasping as each wave tore me apart. Fear gripped me tighter than the pain. Fear that I was too weak, and I would fail the child before he even took his first breath. Buck never left my side. He brought water to my lips, wiped sweat from my brow, whispered words in Apache I couldn't understand but somehow trusted. His voice was low, steady, carrying me through each shudder as though he believed for both of us. Hours passed, though they felt like days. The storm outside roared in time with the storm inside me, each howl of wind echoing the cries I tried to stifle. At one point, I broke down, sobbing, I can't! I can't do it! Buck caught my gaze, his dark eyes unwavering. You can. You will. You're stronger than you think. Something in the way he said it, not pleading, not commanding, but believing, steadied me. I clung to his words like a rope in floodwaters. And then, with one last cry that split the night, the cabin filled with a sound greater than the storm, the wail of my son. Buck moved swiftly, wrapping the tiny, slick body in a cloth, his hands gentle though large. He placed the child against my chest, and I stared down at the squalling face, red and furious with life. Matthew. Though I hadn't spoken the name aloud yet, I knew it belonged to him. Tears streamed down my cheeks. Relief, awe, terror, all knotted into one. I had brought life into this world, and yet I knew I had not done it alone. Buck's hands, Buck's words, Buck's steadfast presence had carried me through. As the storm raged on outside, Buck sat beside me, exhaustion etched across his features, but pride burning in his eyes. He laid a hand on the child's tiny back and said simply, "He is ours. Not mine, not hers, ours." The word struck deeper than any vow spoken in that hollow church. For the first time, I believed it might be true. We were no longer strangers bound by duty. We were a family, forged in blood, pain, and storm. I held Matthew tighter, feeling the warmth of Buck's arm around us both, and knew the course of my life had changed forever.
By summer, the snows melted into streams, and the meadow outside Buck's cabin bloomed with wildflowers. Matthew had grown strong in my arms, his dark hair thick like mine, his eyes still undecided between the shades of his blood. The cabin, once a cage of shame, had become a home filled with laughter. Mine, Buck's, even Matthew's coos. For a time, I believed the past had finally loosened its grip. Then Samuel Reed returned. I saw him first from the window, riding up the trail as if he owned it. His hat tipped back, his coat trimmed finer than most in town. He looked much the same as when he left me, handsome, cocky, a smile that once melted my resolve. But now, that smile cut deep like a reopened wound. He dismounted without a word and strode to the cabin door, boots crunching in the dust. Buck opened it before Samuel could knock. They stood eye to eye, the silence between them sharp as a drawn blade. "Ivy," Samuel said, his gaze darting past Buck to me, "you've got my boy in your arms." The gall of him, to ride away when I needed him most, then return claiming rights over the life he'd abandoned? My grip tightened on Matthew, who whimpered against my breast. "You've made a mistake," Samuel went on, voice smooth as ever. "Marrying this savage. I'll take you back now, you and the child." I felt the old pull, the familiar charm that once wrapped around me like velvet, but it tangled now with the memory of nights spent alone, tears staining a cloth Buck had given me, storms weathered with no one but him at my side. Buck didn't flinch. His hands hung loose at his sides, but I saw the tension in his shoulders. Samuel's own hand hovered near his revolver, fingers twitching. "You'll step back," Buck said, calm as stone. Samuel sneered. "You think you can keep her? You think this child belongs to you? Look at him. He's mine." I looked down at Matthew, his tiny face nestled close. Blood might have bound him to Samuel, but it was Buck who had hailed him first, Buck who had carved his cradle board, Buck who had loved him without hesitation. Something in me broke free. I stepped forward, clutching my son, and faced Samuel. My voice shook, but the truth in it was iron. "No, you left us. You left me. Buck is his father now, and my husband." Samuel's eyes widened, disbelief twisting into rage. His hand twitched again at his revolver, but Buck didn't move, didn't blink. The standoff stretched long enough for the cicadas outside to drone like drums. Finally, Samuel spit into the dirt, his pride cut deeper than any bullet could wound. He mounted his horse and wheeled it sharply, dust rising in his wake. I stood there trembling, my heart pounding, but certain at last. Samuel Reed was my past, a shadow that haunted me. Buck was my present, my choice, my truth, the man I would stand beside even if the whole world called me a fool. That night, with Matthew asleep between us, I whispered to Buck, "I love you." The words felt raw, unpolished, but they were real. For the first time in my life, they were real. Word traveled faster than the wind in our little town, and by the time I rode down with Buck for supplies, whispers already buzzed in the mercantile like flies on a carcass. Samuel Reed had spread his venom, telling anyone who'd listen that Matthew was his blood, stolen by an Apache and paraded as legitimate. The moment I stepped through the door, I felt eyes prick my back. Mrs. Carver, with her sharp tongue and sharper nose, paused in her measuring of sugar to whisper into another woman's ear. The young man snickered, too loud to be an accident. The air turned thick with judgment, and my cheeks burned hot with shame I thought I had buried. I tried to keep my chin high, but the shame of my belly months ago, the hurried wedding, the empty church, It all came rushing back. Every whisper felt like a stone hurled against my chest. Samuel's charm had always bought him friends, and now it bought me humiliation. I reached for a sack of flour and fumbled it, nearly spilling it across the counter. My hand shook, my eyes stung. That's when Buck stepped close, his palm steady against the small of my back. Just that. No words, no dramatic defense, only the quiet weight of his presence, reminding me I wasn't alone. The whispers didn't stop, but my shame shifted into something sharper, anger. I turned and faced the room, my voice steady, though my heart pounded. Yes, I said, Matthew is Samuel Reed's blood, but blood don't make a father. Buck does. He's the man who stayed, the man who held me through storm and brought my son into this world when no one else would. The room fell quiet. Mrs. Carver pursed her lips, but no words came. The young man who'd snickered dropped his gaze to the floorboards. I knew the gossip wouldn't end that day. Rumors linger like smoke long after the fire's gone, but I had faced them. I had spoken my truth, and in doing so, I felt the chains of shame loosened for good. When we stepped back into the sunlight, I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Buck glanced at me, a question in his eyes, and I nodded. I chose this, I told him. Not because Father forced me, not because Samuel left me, because I want it. I want you. His hand lingered at my back as we walked to the wagon, and for the first time in town, I didn't feel bowed by stares. Felt taller, stronger, not as the colonel's daughter, not as Samuel's discarded girl, but as Buck's wife. Autumn painted the mountains gold and crimson, and for the first time since leaving Father's house, I felt the rhythm of a life that was truly mine. The cabin rang with Matthew's laughter as he toddled across the floor. Buck's steady hands always near to catch him when he wobbled. My shame had faded into memory, replaced by something sturdier than pride, peace. It was Buck's idea to host a gathering before the snows returned. I balked at first, worried about whispers, but he said simply, "Let 'em see." And so one crisp afternoon, neighbors came up the trail along with a handful of Buck's Apache kin. Horses lined the meadow, voices carried in two tongues, and for a while the air felt fragile, as though any wrong word might break it. I stood on the porch with Matthew on my hip, watching as Mrs. Carver accepted a cup of coffee from Buck's cousin, her usual sharpness dulled by curiosity. Children from both sides chased each other through the grass. For all the tension, something new was happening, a mingling neither town nor tribe had dared before. Of course, Samuel's shadow lingered. I heard one man murmur, "That boy's Reed's blood, no mistaking it." My chest tightened, but Buck's hand found mine, grounding me. And in that moment, the truth burned clear. It didn't matter whose blood ran in Matthew's veins. What mattered was the love that filled this house, this yard, this family. I lifted Matthew high, his giggles carrying over the crowd, and spoke loud enough for those nearby to hear. "This is my son, our son, and he will only ever know love." The words silenced the murmurs. Buck's eyes met mine, and I saw in them not the patience of duty, but the fire of chosen devotion. He squeezed my hand once, firm and sure,
as if sealing a vow we had both been shaping since that empty church. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, Buck's kin shared stories by the fire, and neighbors lingered longer than I expected, laughter slowly overtaking suspicion. I realized then that our life, once born of command and shame, had become something greater, a bridge, a family, a truth I could claim without fear. That night, after the last horseman had ridden off and the cabin settled into quiet again, Buck held Matthew against his chest, humming softly in his mother's tongue. I leaned against him, tired but filled with a fullness I hadn't known possible. I had begun this journey bowed by disgrace, bartered like a token of silence. Now I stood as a wife, a mother, and most of all, a woman who had chosen her own home. The ghosts of the past would always whisper, but they no longer ruled me. Love did, and that love was enough to carry us through every storm the mountains might bring.